So welcome to tonight's talk and welcome to the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. For those of you who don't know me, I am Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at UCL, and I'm also the Academic Director of the Centre, which was established a few years ago in memory of the late British historian. Sir Martin was, of course, the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill and was also a prolific author on a wide-ranging number of subjects, including the First and Second World War, the Holocaust, the history of Israel, the history of the modern Jewish experience, and more. And we offer a suitably wide-ranging program of events. So we look forward to seeing you at other events as well, if this is the first event you're joining us for. Today, we will be hearing about a topic that is both significant and very resonant, I think, with current events as we watch a refugee crisis of enormous proportions taking place in Europe. We will be hearing about the work of two fantastic oral history archives, which have preserved the voices of Jewish refugees in Britain before and after the Second World War. And those two archives are first the Refugee Voices Testimony Archive, which was created under the auspices of the Association for Jewish Refugees, and the Sephardi Voices Testimony Archive. Both of these archives really do extraordinary work and deserve to be much more widely known and used. So I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome tonight Dr. Be'er Lewkowicz, who is the co-founder and director of both of these two projects, and is going to be telling us a little bit about them. Be'er is a social anthropologist and an oral historian, and she leads a team of archivists, editors, cameramen, and interviewers. And she has also conducted many interviews herself over the last 30 years. In addition to her work as an oral historian, Be'er is also a researcher in her own right. She has done work on oral history, trauma and memory, diasporas and displacement, and nationalism and ethnicity. And among her publications are a book titled Émigré Voices, Conversations with Jewish Refugees from Germany and Austria, that's newly out by Brill, and that was co-authored with Anthony Grenville. And she has also published a book called The Jewish Community of Salonika, History, Memory, Identity, and that was published in 2006. And I will put some links in the chat to those archives and to Be'er's work if you're interested in following up more. But now I would like to hand over to Be'er. Be'er will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. And after that, we will open up the floor for your questions and comments. And Be'er's talk tonight is titled Testimonies of Jewish Refugee Women in Britain.
Thank you so much, Shirley, for this introduction. I'd like to express my gratitude to the Martin Gilbert Learning Centre for inviting me to speak tonight and to share some of my work with testimonies from the AGR Refugee Voices and Sephardi Voices archives. When I chose the theme of this lecture, refugee women, I thought it would be good to pay tribute to some of the amazing women we have in our archive the week after International Women's Day.
Be'er, sorry, you seem to have muted yourself.
Sorry, where did you lose me?
About 5 seconds ago.
So I was saying, when I chose this theme, I thought it would be good to pay tribute to the amazing women, but I did not anticipate that it would resonate so much with our reality today, the reality of war in the Ukraine, which made thousands of women and children leave their homes, their fathers, brothers, husbands, and become refugees. Listening to the harrowing stories of escape, I cannot help to feel sad, as I know very well, based on my years of interviewing refugees and survivors, that the traumatic experiences of bombardment, starvation, escape, family separation, and resettlement will have a long-term impact on the lives of all the men, women, children who are facing this extremely difficult situation. On the other hand, the stories we have collected over the years can also inspire us and help the current situation, as they tell us about resilience and activism and the power of non-governmental agencies and individuals. I feel that it's very poignant that Sir Martin Gilbert was one of the few British historians who in his academic work dealt with the Holocaust, World War II, and the survivors who came to the UK, but also with the history of Jews in Muslim lands. In fact, In Ishmael's House was the last of the many books he wrote. And I recall fondly when we interviewed him in 2010, and he was very enthusiastic about the creation of Sephardi Voices, as he thought that the history of Jews from the Middle East, North Africa, and Iran was not very well known, both within the Jewish community and also within wider historiography. Now, let me start sharing my screen. So today, I'd like to take this opportunity and look at the stories of women refugees in Britain across AGR Refugee Voices and Sephardi Voices UK, and tell you a little bit more about these archives. Please go to our websites where you can find out much more information and also watch some films and edited bits of interviews. Both archives deal with the largest group of Jewish immigration to Britain in the 20th century, before and after World War II. In Refugee Voices, the first archive, the immigration of the Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria before World War II, but also the settlement of a smaller group of Holocaust survivors after World War II, straight after the war, but also in 1956 from Hungary. The number of these Jews is estimated to be around 70,000, including the 10,000 unaccompanied children who came on the Kinder transport and the 4,000 men on transit visas allowed to come to the Kitchener camp. And, you know, just talking today about the Kinder transport, of course, is meaningful, where the government just released a scheme where you can sponsor refugees, including children. And maybe we can discuss that a bit later. The second, Sephardi Voices, covers the immigration of Jewish refugees and migrants from the Middle East, North Africa, and Iran in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Figures for this migrations are harder to estimate. We know that the number of Sephardi Mizrahi Jews make up roughly 6% of the Jewish population in Britain, and is estimated to be around 15,000. The UK was not the main country of destination for the refugees, so we have to bear that in mind, who left the countries post-1948, following the rise of nationalist movements and expulsions, for example, from Egypt in 1956. Of the roughly 820,000 refugees between 1948 and 1972, more than 200,000 found refuge in Europe and North America, while 586,000 were resettled in Israel. The historical context of the 1930s and the Holocaust is, of course, very different to the historical context of the Sephardi Mizrahi immigration, which is embedded in the wider history of colonialism, the end of empires, the emergence of Arab nationalism, and the creation of the State of Israel. The impact of World War II, however, is present in some of the recorded Sephardi Voices interviews with interviewees from Morocco and Algeria, who suffered under the pro-Nazi Vichy regime, with interviews from Tunisia and Libya, who had experienced the occupation by the German and Italian army, and with the interviewees from Iraq, who were victims of the Fahud, the anti-Jewish pogrom in June 1941, which occurred in a power vacuum following the collapse of the pro-Nazi government of Rashid Ali and the British victory in the Anglo-Iraqi War. And it is estimated that about 600 Jews were killed and 1,000 injured, 900 shops and homes looted in the Fahud in 1941. So let me say something about the history of our archives and about the methodology we use. I co-founded the AGR Refugee Voices archive in 2003, together with Dr. Anthony Grenville. Following a successful video installation for the Continental Britons exhibition in 2002, we approached the Association of Jewish Refugees, founded as a self-help association for its members in 1941, and they agreed to fund this exciting new project. Our mission was to capture the life stories of the refugees and survivors from Nazi Europe who had found refuge in the UK. Our first interview took place in 2003, and in 2008, we finished our 150th interview, and the interviews were deposited with our partner institutions. We applied an oral history approach with open questions and the notion that the interviewer's role is to help the interviewee tell her or his story without too many interruptions. Our focus was not only the Holocaust, but the entire life history of the interviewee. When it became clear that there were still people who wanted to be interviewed, we restarted again in 2015, and the project is still ongoing. And I should say, I find myself that there are lots of requests from first generation survivors, refugees who still want to be interviewed. So far, we have 262 interviews in our collection. In 2010, the opportunity came along to create a similar archive for a different group of Jewish refugees, the Jews who were displaced post-1948. So we set up Sephardi Voices. Sephardi Voices UK, we set it up as a charity and followed the same methodology as in Refugee Voices. And it will be interesting at some point to compare the interviews in detail. With Sephardi Voices, we faced a greater reluctance to give testimony, which I think is due to many factors. For example, in the case of the Iranian refugees, maybe fear of repercussions for relatives still in Iran, something to do with notions of pride in public and whether people feel comfortable to give an interview, which is a public interview. It's also a more recent immigration. There is a lack of public commemoration that changed recently in the last few years, where you have the 30th of November, which commemorates the expulsion of Jews from Arab lands. But there is definitely a lack of popular discourse, which makes it, I think, more difficult for individuals to come forward and, and tell their stories. In total, we have now conducted almost 120 interviews, and they're all accessible at the British Library. Both the AGR Refugee Voices and the Sephardi Voices archive were conceptualized as rigorous oral history archives, which will preserve the unique experiences, insights, and perspective of the men and women who narrated their lives, lived within the historical and cultural parameters of the time. The value of the stories goes beyond the academic objective. For families, it is invaluable to have a recorded film of a father, mother, grandfather, grandmother. And sometimes by bringing private stories into the public, we can make relevant connections. I was recently very happy to facilitate a contact between a child of a family who fostered 2 kindertransportees in Wales and the former kindertransportee. And the child of the former foster family was looking for the kindertransportee and found them on our website. Today, I will focus on the women in our archive. In recent migration and refugee studies research, it is widely accepted that gender plays an important part in the migration process. In the introduction to the yearbook of the German and Austrian exile studies, dedicated to the theme of exile and gender, Brinston, Borisova, and Hummel discussed the double marginalization of women, firstly by their refugee status and secondly by their gender. They also talk about the twin poles of women experiences, achievements, and loss, and the spectrum in between. And here I just put some photos for you together from our archives, and the names are the interviewees, and that's due to their courtesy that we can use these photographs. So today I'd like to pay tribute to the women I've interviewed over the last 20 years and describe some of their experiences in more detail. They came to Britain as refugees, for Sephardi Voices in some cases as migrants from France and Israel. They came at different ages and at different times, as children or young adults, with or without their families, and they faced many challenges as refugees and as women in creating new lives and homes in this country. The wonderful aspect of any oral history archive is that the narratives of the interviewees do not only document their own lives, but also the lives of other women, such as their own mothers. And you can see here at the bottom of this slide, a photo of the scientist Regina Adler-Kappler, who is the mother of our interviewee Lieselotte Kastner. And she was a scientist who invented a visionary pregnancy test in Vienna and was invited because of her research to come to the UK. The interviews also tell us about the mothers of host families and the women who saved their lives. And 2 women for me stand out in this respect. Our interviewee Lily Pohlmann, who was hidden in Lviv, by the German civil servant Irmgard Wied in her flat. Here's a picture of Irmgard Wied on the left. And Rabbi Jacobi, who was saved by the incredible efforts of the Dutch Truus Weissmuller, a Dutch woman who instigated the first kindertransport of 600 children to come out of Vienna and managed to get the last group of kindertransport children from Amsterdam on a boat to leave Holland in May 1940. So this is just an example of other women mentioned in the archive who are not the interviewees. The AGR Refugee Voices archive holds 262 interviews, as I said before, of whom 139 are women. And you can here see the statistics. They were born between 1906 and 1945. And Eva Clark is here in the audience with us. So you can see her here on the right. Eva, thank you for joining us tonight. Eva is the youngest interviewee, born on the 29th of April 1945 in Mauthausen concentration camps, a few days before Mauthausen was liberated by the American army. And on the left, you see Margaret Simmons, born in 1906, who, when she came, had to leave her son behind in Germany. She'd been married to a German, non-Jewish German, and the son couldn't come with her to England. And you can see the age pyramid here as well. We have 27 women who came as young adults to the UK, born between 1906 and 1920, 70 women born between 21 and 1930, and 42 women born between 1930 and 1945. The largest number of women was born in Germany and Austria, as you can see here. I was quite surprised that it's actually 78 from Germany, and mostly from Berlin and Vienna, but other cities as well. And most interviewees emigrated to the UK in the late 30s. The women who survived in concentration camps, in hiding or outside Europe, came mostly to the UK after World War II. The majority of women we interviewed led private lives, but some are better known. So just to show you a few women who are better known. So we interviewed the violinist Mary Littke, the pianist Natalie Karp, Ursula Owen, who is the founder of Virago Press, journalist Hella Pick, and Selma van der Perre, a Dutch survivor who was in the Dutch resistance, who recently published her autobiography called My Name is Selma. Photographers Dorothy Bohm and Inge Eder, writers Eva Feijes and Inga Joseph, psychotherapist Iska Wittenberg, and scientists Gerta Vrbova, Trudy Silman, Eve Willman, and the dancer and dance teacher Stella Mann. But most women in the Refugee Voices archive worked at some point in their lives. They also changed professions and helped in the husband's business. And here I put together the list of professions, which gives you a little idea about what the women in our archive did. And it's interesting: 21 teachers, 10 housewives, many self-employed, artists, 13, academics, 8, editors, translators, secretaries, psychologists, psychotherapists, 8, fashion, and many more. This is just to give a sort of rough overview. Coming back to the Exile and Gender Yearbook, let me quote again from my introduction. Princeton and Hamel convey a strong sense of the gendered experience of refugee women in terms of the experience of persecution in Germany and Austria, in terms of their active role in the immigration process, in terms of their willingness to support family members by taking on menial, low-paid work, and in terms of their vulnerability as domestic servants and kindertransportees in foster homes. Tony Kushner estimates that almost 20,000 refugees arrived in Britain as domestic servants, as domestic employment enabled women to get an entry visa to the UK. And the experiences of the domestic service was often a very difficult one for the young refugee women. They often lived in unheated and insanitary rooms or sharing rooms with no private spaces. They struggled to survive on wages below £1 a week, had little free time, and suffered from hunger. And in fact, even today, this is still an under-researched area, and there's a lot of information in Refugee Voices. It is difficult to summarize the many other themes expressed in the narratives of the interviewees. Loss and dispersion of family is certainly very important. Post-war lives in profession and as mothers, many women didn't get married. Often if they had children, they didn't have more than 2 children. But the women discuss lack of grandparents and also the building of communities. The Sephardi Voices archive contains interviews with almost 60 women who mostly came to the UK between 1950 and 1959. Just looking at some of the photographs we collected for the archive, you can see the huge changes which have taken place in the communities our interviews came from. In many communities, education for the mothers and grandmothers had been restricted and women were expected to marry at a very young age. Of course, the situation varied enormously from country to country and from urban to rural communities. What the women have in common is that they've grown up in multilingual, multicultural, and multi-religious environments where Jews occupied liminal spaces, living in the legacy of the Ottoman Empire and in societies governed by European colonial powers or newly emerged nation states, such as Iraq, which became an independent republic became independent in 1932. Being exposed to European culture meant for many to be educated in French, Italian, or British schools and having access to French, Italian, or British citizenship. In contrast to the Jewish refugee experience in the 1930s, most women in Sephardi Voices came with their families to the UK or came because of marriage, mostly after emigrating to France or Israel. A few had been sent to British boarding schools before they were joined by the wider family, especially the girls from Sudan. And many more were sent to study abroad ahead of the family's emigration. And that was mostly boys were sent ahead. For example, Ellis Dweck, who is Claudia Roden's brother, talks about being sent to a boarding school and many others. In some cases from Iraq, the separation from a child who was sent out to study lasted a long time, as the young person's citizenship was taken away while in Britain and the parents were not allowed to leave Iraq. Let's look at our Sephardi Voices statistics. In terms of country of birth, it's not surprising that 25 women came from Egypt, as this was the largest group of Jews given refuge in the UK. Our oldest interviewer is Marcel Chamash, born in 1921 in Baghdad, and our youngest interviewer is Elizabeth Barkani, born 1964 in Tunisia. 50 women were born in the 1940s, 31 in the 30s, and 24 in the 1920s. And it gives you here, you can see, when people migrated as well. The next slide shows you, again, the professions and occupations in a bit more detail. And you can see that the Sephardi Voices interviews worked in various professions. Some stayed at home, raised the family, and were housewives. That's the tall comment in the middle, 12. Many were teachers in parallel to Refugee Voices. But what is interesting, if you look on the right, is the change. If you look at the professions of their mothers, where 42 of the mothers of the interviewees were housewives. Post-emigration, women needed to support their families and had the opportunities to enter the workplace. So that's a big change. And here are some of the remarkable women we have interviewed. The wonderful food writer and artist Linda Dangor from Iraq, artist Bettina Caro, Moroccan-born, politician Dame Hodge. She was born in Egypt, but to German and Austrian parents, and emigrated in the late 40s to Britain. The renowned historian of the Middle East, Sylvia Qaadri. Then you see on the right here, Habiba Kojaman from Iraq, who spent 5 years in an Iraqi prison for belonging to the Communist Party. And her husband actually spent 12 years in prison before emigrating to Israel. Then we have Niran Basuntiman, who is a political activist and commentator. She's very active on social media and engages with a huge Arabic-speaking audience. And on the left, Naomi Pope from in Burma, who was a British volunteer on the famous Exodus, which sailed to Palestine. And this is just to give you a little flavor. Looking out at the pictures on our TV screens in the past few weeks, we're suddenly also aware of the enormous impact of war and displacement. In the live story we have gathered for Refugee Voices and Sephardi Voices, all interviewees have experienced migration, displacement, and loss of language, loss of culture, loss of possessions. They also experienced, to a greater and lesser degree, persecution, sometimes linked to violence and imprisonment, dispersal. So large families became small families. Linda Dangor in her interview says, we were a tribe and we became a unit. Or Nicolette Mawas from Alexandria describes herself saying she was part of a forest, and coming to England, she is a tree, an only tree. The dispersal also leads to emigration to multiple countries, often more countries involved than in Refugee Voices. People didn't settle only in one country. In Refugee Voices, of course, separation from the nuclear family, and often the death of parents or one parent. Another common feature is the loss of status. Large households with servants became small families. For Refugee Voices, lack of educational opportunities for young adults in Refugee Voices. Children who came on the kinder transport, they were not allowed to finish their education, they had to start work when they were 16. And lastly, also help from refugee agencies. And again, very pertinent today because of the situation. So the Central British Fund, today called World Jewish Relief, helped the refugees in 1939, but also in 1956, when 25,000 Jews from Egypt were expelled and some came to the UK. They were housed in hostels and refugee camps. And I looked at, in preparation for this, I found the 26th annual report for the Central British Fund, which catered at that point in 1956 for 622 Egyptian families, and found that 338 of these families had British nationality, although most had never set foot in the UK before. The long-term impact of having been a refugee or migrant and the issue of identity and belonging are important themes which are discussed in most interviews. One Tunisian interviewee said to me, "I'm a bit French, a bit Arab, and very Jewish." Another woman described herself Iraqi with the Mediterranean flair. Another said, "I'm Jewish, Egyptian-born, French, and a British subject." Other themes which are discussed are specific traditions, the importance of food, and recollection of rich cultural lives. Many women talk about feeling responsible for passing on their traditions and culture to their children. And this is where the true value of oral history lies. It allows you on the one hand to gather undocumented information of historical experiences, but it also allows us to understand how individuals make sense of their own experiences and how they interpret their lives. In an important article on individual memory of Jews from Muslim Arab lands, entitled, you can see it here on the left, Sharing and Unsharing Memories, Life Stories of Jews from Muslim Arab Lands, Fear, Anger, and Discontent Within a Silence Displacement, Sarah Fournier-Cohen asked how the interviewees have represented their displacement and their uprooting. She finds that lingering emotions of fear, anger, and discontent are represented side by side notions of agency and ownership of one's trajectory. When contextualizing and interpreting life histories, we also need to bear in mind the interplay between memory and identity. Whether individuals talk about their lives in terms of ruptures and displacements and trauma, or in terms of choice, professional, economic motives for immigration, and agency, is dependent of the current self-perception and identity of the narrator. As Anse and Lambeck put it in the introduction to the book you can see here on the screen, 10 Past Cultural Essays in Trauma and Memory, quote, "Memories are produced out of experience and in turn reshape it. This implies that memory is intrinsically linked to identity. And this means that on the one hand, narrated memories reflect the current identity of the narrator. On the other, the current identity is shaped by the particular experiences of the individual." And I find this quite a useful methodology. So what I'd like to do now is look at specific interviews with these questions in mind. How are narratives shaped by the identities of the interviewees, and how do the narratives differ in terms of their representation of loss and agency? I'm going to look at the interviews of Ivy Shashua and Eilean Khalashi, both born in Baghdad, 1933 and 1929, and Susan Einzig and Ursula Gilbert, born 1922 and 1923 in Berlin. Ivy Shashua. Ivy Shashua was born 1933 in Baghdad. She was one of 5 children. Her father worked in the construction business. They lived in the Qarada district of Baghdad. She talks in great detail about the Fahud pogrom in 1941. Following the Fahud, they escaped to Iran and came back a few months later. 2 of her brothers were sent to study to the UK. In the early 50s, her sister and grandmother left for Israel. They were part of the mass immigration of about 120,000 Jews, which, when Iraq allowed Jews to leave if they renounced their citizenship and gave up their property and their assets to the Iraqi state. The father did not want to emigrate as he was waiting for a court case to finish. She and her 2 younger siblings were too young to renounce their citizenship, and they tried to emigrate, pretending to be somebody else's children. This did not work, And she received papers which made her 5 years older, but by then the emigration scheme had closed. In 1956, her parents, her brother, and herself received passports which enabled them to travel. With very little luggage, they traveled to Cyprus for a holiday, leaving all their belongings behind. From there, they tried to obtain visas for Canada or India. Ivy and her brother were first deported from Cyprus to Israel after their permit to stay had expired. The parents were eventually also deported to Israel, where they could join the other family members. As 2 of Ivy's brothers had settled in the UK, she attended a wedding in England, where she met her future husband, married in 1961 and settled in Manchester. She had cousins there who had come to the UK in the 1920s and found it easy to adapt. She moved to London to be close to her daughter. The mood of the interview was quite serious, and reading the transcript, this also comes across. There's a sense of fear and rupture which permeates the narrative, and within her first statement, she introduces a trajectory of migration, loss of freedom and movement, persecution, and resettlement, not in a linear chronology. She says, I quote from the beginning of the interview, "My father was born in Baghdad in 1885. My mother was born in Baghdad in 1910. They got married in 1929. We were 5 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, and 3 boys. But then there was 1941. We left Baghdad to go to Persia. We fled Baghdad, went to Persia, waiting for a visa to go anywhere. We couldn't get a visa, so we went back to Baghdad and we started. We lived there again." Even her positive memories of Baghdad, swimming in the river, picnicking on the island, having a cow to come to the house for fresh milk, those positive memories also end with a foreboding, quote, "These are my good memories of Baghdad." Other recollections about life on the farm, school, or Jewish social clubs lead very soon into negative and fearful stories. And I just read you a few quotes. She said, "In the summer, we used to run around in the orchard and the plantation. It was fun. But when we got older, this was all restricted. No more running around and going out on our own or whatever." She talks about Jewish clubs. There were 2 Jewish clubs we were members of, but that dwindled up and stopped in 1940-41 when they became German sympathizers and Rashid Ali came on the scene. That all stopped. And she recalls in graphic detail a very traumatic memory from her school days. Quote, "The only problem I remember at the time, maybe I was the age 11, 12, going to school one day early in the morning, and we saw a body, a young man hanged right outside the school. He was hanged at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and was still there swinging in the air with a black sack on his head until lunchtime. I'll remember this sight till the day I die. It was shocking. Actually, I'm shaking now, remembering the sight, remembering the way we felt at the time. It was terrible. And when we went on the break in the yard, we still looked outside and he was still there till lunchtime." What is interesting here is that all the 3 stories above were not elicited by the interviewer, who asked very general questions. The last quote also illustrates the power of traumatic memory. Although the event is narrated in the past, Ivy Shashua states that she's shaking now, and this encapsulates the intrusion of the past in the present, which we can find in other parts of this interview. When asked about how her experiences affected her life, she says, quote, "Well, I'll tell you, it becomes in you. You always have to be careful, always, always, no matter where you are. You look behind you, no matter. It's in you. I mean, now I've left Baghdad, I've left Israel. I left many, many years ago. It didn't leave me." It's not clear which time period Ivy refers to here. It could be the time between 51 and 1956, a time of limbo and fear, when she tried to emigrate, or the experience of the Fahoud in 1941, which clearly constitutes the most traumatic episodes in Ivy's interview. And she tells me what happened to her as an 8-year-old girl and her family in an uninterrupted narrative of almost 15 minutes. They lived in the, and I can just briefly summarize this here, they lived in the Qarada district of Baghdad, and they were saved by a maid hidden in a hut behind the house. They had to stay there for a whole day. They could hear the mob outside the house, and they were rescued by a friend of her father's who was in the army and came to look for them. He took the entire family away in his car to safety. All their possessions had been taken, and after months, as their cousins, they went to Iran. While the past is very present in the narrative of Ivy Shashua, we can detect a sense of discontinuity and ending when it comes to her current identity. She describes herself as, quote, "somebody who tries to join and be accepted. She also says her grandchildren are being brought up in a Jewish way, but not very Sephardi. They won't eat the food that I do, not much of it, very few dishes. And it's different, it's different. At the end of the interview, almost in a way of summarizing her losses, she shows me the only object which was brought out from Baghdad. Oh, it's here. The only object which was brought out from Baghdad, a gold ring which belonged to her husband. Ivy's ring becomes a treasured linking object, which allows the past to inhabit the everyday of the present. And we have many more photographs of objects like this in our archive. But I do feel it's become a symbol of enormous loss, the enormous loss Ivy experienced, both of place and culture. Eilean Khalashi was born in 1929 into a prominent family in Baghdad. Her grandfather was Ezra Dangour, the chief rabbi of Baghdad. He established a printing house in Baghdad, which published first Hebrew manuscript and later publications in Arabic. Eilean talks about her life in Baghdad and the house she grew up in the neighborhood of Bataween. She describes in great detail inhabitants of the house, the family, and the personnel. After leaving school, Eilean was engaged while on holidays in France to David Khalashi, her future husband, and she tells us about the henna party and the wedding. She also describes the ups and downs the community experienced in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. She and her husband took care of the parents, and they were not allowed to leave until 1974, when they received passports. They came to London, where they joined family members who had settled in the UK. They joined Lauderdale Road Synagogue, and she became involved in the Scribe magazine, set up by her brother, the philanthropist Sir Naim Dangour. Eilean, in her interview, conveys a very strong sense of nostalgia for her life in Baghdad. She talks about sleeping on the roof, about the food, walking near the river, and her rich social life, and cultural continuity. Again, the food, speaking Arabic to her children. She talks very proudly of her heritage. Although she stayed in Iraq much longer than Ivy and hence experienced many more waves of persecution, for example, the public hanging of Jewish men in 1969, Eilean focused on the good life and describes incident of persecution only at certain points of the interview. She repeats throughout the interview, quote, "On the whole, it was a good life, apart from being afraid from time to time." When asked, "Do you have any personal memories of the time in Baghdad that you could tell us about?" she said, "It was a good life. On the whole, it was a good life. Apart from incident like 41, there was the Fahud." And the world apart is very telling here. In her narrative, her anti-Jewish experiences are not part of her core narrative. They stand apart. They are compartmentalized. While in Ivy's interview, the interviewer's questions about schools and Jewish clubs elicited narrative which lead to negative experiences, here it's almost the opposite. When talking about the closure of Jewish clubs, Eilean goes straight into the opening of other mixed multicultural clubs. She says, "We used to have 3 clubs in Baghdad, Jewish clubs, but after 48, they took the clubs from us. We used to meet there. But in 52, there was the Mansour Club, a mixed club, and we were members there. We had a good life after 52. When asked about Jews being worried about their situation, she said, "Well, I tell you, we were Iraqis. We cherished our country. So whatever happened, we didn't want to. We never thought of leaving the country. We had good friends, Muslim friends. I mean, they were not at all bad. But the government was against us." Rather than a sense of discontinuity and loss, by seeing herself as Iraqi, Eilean conveys a sense of continuity and coherence. Her Iraqi identity does not seem to have been affected by her migration. When asked about her identity, she says, "No, I'm not British. I'm Iraqi, 100% Iraqi, and I love Iraq. But unfortunately, we can't be there." At the end of the interview, she shares many photographs with us and shows us the Haggadah her grandfather printed in Hebrew with Arabic letters. So even her linking object is not one of loss, but one which symbolizes the positive contribution of Jews in Baghdad. And of course, there are many reasons why Ivy Shashua's and Eilean Khalashi's narratives are so different. One of them is age. Eilean was married in the early 50s. Ivy could not study and had to stay at home. Then the second is time of emigration. Eilean spent more of her adult life in Iraq, while Ivy left earlier. And this brings me back to the earlier point about identities and memories. Their different biographical experience shape their current identity, which then in turn influences the content and form of the narrated memories. Eilean's strong sense of Iraqiness allows a narrative which plays down her anti-Semitic experience and allows her to look back on her life in Iraq with a great sense of nostalgia. While Ivy's traumatic experiences of the Fahoud and confinement in the early 50s made her feel that she was, quote, treated like a second-class citizen in Iraq, and made it a place from where her family had escaped, quote, leaving everything behind. And this sentence is repeated throughout the interview. So it creates a narrative of rupture in terms of the migratory trajectory, but also in terms of the chronology of the interviews, where bad experiences resurface in different parts of the interviews. Eilean's narrative, in contrast, creates a narrative of agency in which difficult circumstances are overcome. Despite Ivy's traumatic experiences and loss of citizenship and deportation to Israel, she describes herself as not being a refugee. Quote, "I'm not a refugee. I changed place of abode. I'm not a refugee. I didn't ask for help. I wasn't, challenged to do this or do that. So no." And this raises many questions about notions of refuginess and exile versus notions of transition and change, or different relevance for different interviewees across the Sephardi Voices and Refugee Voices archive. One Refugee Voices interview, who also did not consider herself a refugee, states, quote, "Exile dawns in you in bits and pieces. And as a historian working with oral histories, we need to find these bits and pieces in each interview." So I was going to talk a bit more about two other women, but I don't have that much time. So I'm just going to sort of summarize the story of Ursula Gilbert and Susan Einzig, who both came on the Kindertransport. Ursula was born in 1923, and she had a sister who was 1 year older than her, who was too old to come on the Kindertransport. She came out on the 15th of March. And there was a relative who had emigrated in 1933, and they found a foster family for her. They took her in, and the family was quite orthodox. She didn't like it, and she moved to refugee hostels, which is not untypical of these refugees who turned 16 or 17, so they could move away from a family into a hostel. She trained in the millinery shop and started doing war work. She met her husband in the Free German Youth. They married in 1949. She worked part-time in market research and became members of Belzai Square Synagogue, a synagogue founded by German Jewish refugees. Here's Susan Einzig, who also came on the Kindertransport in 1939. She came to former neighbors of her family in Berlin. She started she studied at the Central School of Art, did war work from 1942 to 1945, and became a freelance illustrator and started teaching at the Camberwell School of Art. She's quite well known for her cover on a children's book called Tom Midnight's Garden. She became a single mother, had a daughter in 1954 and a son in 1961, and she talks quite explicitly about the importance of having a daughter to ground her life. Her mother survived the war and came to the UK against her wishes. They lived together until the mother went back in the Berlin in the 1970s. So Ursula Gilbert's parents didn't survive. Susan's mother did survive. The two women had very different lives and have very different ways of dealing with their past in their narrative. And one striking difference when reading the transcripts is the sense of cohesion and agencies in Ursula Gilbert's interview, and a sense of disjointedness and disorder in Susan Einzig's interview. And it was quite difficult for me even to capture the timeline of the biography of Susan Einzig based on the interview, because it's so disjointed in the actual interview. While Ursula Gilbert relates to the questions of the interview, but she also has a very clear idea what she wants to talk about, specifically the role of her father in the Kindertransport until his deportation to Auschwitz. In Susan Einzig interview, we don't get a sense that she has an agenda and the theme she wants to talk about her painter colleagues and teachers. And she's very critical of herself. She says, "I was confused, I was selfish," which causes the interviewer to become very reaffirming and unsure of the questions to ask. So it's quite a difficult interview. She also is very critical of her own family, of her own father, which contrasts to Ursula Gilbert, who was very close to her father. And here at the end of Ursula's interview, is another, which I call the linking object, where her father gave her a prayer book with 10 notes in it, 10 notes for Ursula, and it's one of my favorite documents in our archive in Refugee Voices, where where he gives sort of tips how to behave in a foreign land, and especially point 10 I think is very poignant. I'll read it to you. The father says, no matter how hard life is, remember that only hope and faith can advance mankind and each individual. Remember that the sun of happiness has always shone for you and that you're now going to a new homeland. And obviously this is a valued possession for Ursula. In contrast to this, Susan Einstein says in the interview that she destroyed all the marvelous letters of her father because she didn't want to know about her gloomy past. So the prayer book and the letters are tangible connections to Ursula's past, while the deliberate destruction of such letters reveal a tragic and unrepairable ruptures with Susan's past. So how do they describe themselves in terms of identity? So Susan Einstein says, I don't think I've ever become English. I don't think so. My identity depends on being what is so despised. I'm a European, I'm a Jew, I'm a human being, I belong. I have no sense of Jewishness. Ursula Gilbert says, definitely British, not German. No, I've got nothing to be proud of. I mean, Germany is Hitler Germany. And thanks, no, that's no good. Thank you very much. I've lived here since I was 15, and there's no question about that. The feelings of not belonging goes hand in hand with the feelings of disconnectedness in Susan's interview, but the feeling of belonging, definitely British in Ursula's narrative, corresponds with a sense of agency, coping, and narrative cohesion. And I'm going to finish soon, but I just wanted to show you how Ursula ends her interview. And that is what she says at the end. My happy family life was interrupted and I lost my parents and my sister. And I tried to work myself up to a sort of useful and nice human being. I found my own family and I managed to study. So I've got something I can say I can be proud of. I'm happy and I've got no regrets really. I mean, all the things that happened to me in wartime and being a refugee, I can only make Mr. Hitler responsible for it, nobody else. And that's how it is. And I had to come to terms with that. It's no good saying I resent it in any way, because that's how it is. So I need to come back to the point of memory, identity, and historical experiences. I hope that I've managed to illustrate how the 4 women I focused on today narrated their own lives and how they made sense of their histories as a result of their own experiences and choices, which shaped their identities and which in turn shaped the way they remember the past. Their voices represent the broad spectrum of women's refugee stories positioned on a spectrum between loss and achievement and rupture and continuity. While remembering the past is important for many, in their messages, the interviewees point us also to the future. And I would like to finish here with 2 quotes, one from Jocelyn Schrager, born in 1945 in Algiers. She says, don't look back on the past, look onto the future. Just make the best out of your life. Don't pine too much, because then you just don't move forward. You don't move forward, but you have to adapt to your circumstances and not pine for the past. And the last quote is from the journalist Hella Pick, born 1929 in Vienna, who was a trailblazer as a woman foreign correspondent in Africa. She says, well, I think for the future, listen to what the likes of us have to say. Draw your own conclusions. But remember, this is not just a project about telling the stories of unhappiness and loss, but they should also be stories about gains and about the lessons that have been learned that can be applied for a future which will create a more stable, better lives and bring people together rather than separate them. I think today, more than ever, we need to look in detail at the lessons we can learn from the experiences recounted in the testimonies in the Sephardi Voices and Refugee Voices archive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bea, for a really terrific overview. Thanks for introducing us to these really, really significant archives and for giving us just a little bit of the flavor. There's such rich, extraordinarily moving stories. And I really would encourage people to go and take a look at the websites and delve into them a little bit more. There are so many stories in there. We have about 10 minutes for questions. And I already have one in the chat, so I'm going to jump right in and ask it. But if others have questions, please do put your hand up using the raise hand function, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen, or you can pop it in the chat as well. So this is a question from Ali Redshaw-Boxwell, who's a PhD student at Newcastle University. She says that her research focuses on the role that creating art, drawings and paintings played in the processing of Holocaust trauma and transition in women from the Holocaust. And she asks if any of the women that you've interviewed made reference to drawing or painting either during internment or after liberation.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting question, because we actually did another presentation where we focused on the artists in our archive, because we have 3 women, 3 in Sephardi Voices and 3 in Refugee Voices. There isn't much reference about art in internment. There are, as far as I know, mostly male. First of all, only 3,000 women were interned. Many more men were interned. So I think most of the painters were male, but the artists we have, one of them is Milan Kosman, another one is a Kindertransport, Johanna Würzburger. They have paintings relevant. They draw on their experiences in their art, and that's the same for Sephardi Voices. I mentioned Linda Dangor, but we have 2 other artists. Bettina Caro draws a lot about her memories from Morocco. So, I think that their lives are very important, and it's expressed in the art. Milan Kosman draws a lot of her paintings. She comes from Düsseldorf, so there's a lot on the Rhineland and the River Rhine. But I think the question was more, is the immigration experience there? And I think, yes, it's there, but it's part of their ongoing lives, rather only, from the time. So I think it stayed with the 6 artists we have in those 2 archives.
Thank you. I was curious to ask you, Bea, you mentioned this briefly in your talk, but one of the things that struck me, as you know, in one of the classes that I was teaching last week, we looked in more detail at some of the testimonies from the Sephardi Voices archive, and it's extraordinary. And one of the things that struck me was this question of identity, and what they call themselves. Are they refugees? Are they migrants? Are they exiles? And of course, Hannah Arendt famously wrote about that. It's it's this complicated question of who are you? And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that in either or both of the archives, about that question.
Well, I think, for me, that's a really interesting part of the interview. And I didn't say that. It's very important for us, in both archives to have, at the end, we have a sort of reflective part where we talk about impact, where we talk about identities, where we talk about belonging, where I ask about homes. And there's a huge, range of answers. I mean, for the Refugee Voices, it's between being very British, between being continental, between being European. For Sephardi Voices, it's quite complex. I think many people would not like to see themselves as refugees. Which is interesting. Of course, some of, definitely the Iraqis and the Egyptians were refugees. I think there is a resistance to see oneself as a refugee. So there is I think a wide spectrum, and maybe it's also age dependent and where you came from. And what I think also for the Sephardi Voices interviews, people, they had British passport, or they went to a British school, so they spoke English. So it's quite different from Refugee Voices, where most of the German, Austrian Jews, they didn't have any English, So I think those are different kinds of migrations, which also then cause different identities. And people, as I said, also, which impacts it is people didn't only go to one country necessarily in Sephardi Mizrahi, Voices. They went to more countries and came from sort of multilingual situation. So some interviews tell us it's quite difficult, when they ask where you're from, they don't know quite what to say because people don't know, it's too complicated. So if you're Egyptian, it's easier to say you're French because then, you know, that's one category. But to explain you're Jewish, you're French speaking, you live in England, that's very complicated. So again, I think there's a lack of discourse available. And you know, I just went to an exhibition in Paris called the Juif d'Orient, which was very interesting about the Jews from the Orient and I was very aware of what language, what categories do we use? And it's, you know, the language is contested as well. You know, is it expulsion? Is it immigration? Is it, you know, so I think it's very difficult for the interviews to position themselves in that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, one is struck looking at the archive by the complexity and the diversity. You mentioned it, but just the sheer diversity of the stories and origins and trajectories. It's amazing. I mean, I can only conclude by saying thank you again for all the work that you have done to create these really extraordinary archives and preserving this treasure trove of individual stories. They are such an important source, not just for historians, but really to be able to share with a broad public so that these stories can be better known. So please go and look at them, tell your friends about them. Thank you again, Bea, on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre for taking the time to come and talk with us today. For all of you, just a reminder that as a charity, we rely on donations so that we can keep our events free at the point of access and reach a wide audience. So any contributions are very gratefully received, and it's very easy to donate on our website. And thank you in advance if you're able to do that. Go ahead, Bea, did you want to say something?
Shirley. Somebody's asking about my book. Can you put it in?
Yes, you mentioned a book written it was in 2006 about the Jews of Salonika.
Yeah, Jewish community of Salonika, History, Memory, Identity, Valentine Mitchell.
Thank you. And just to let you know that our next event is going to be a talk on the 31st of March by Sabina Tanovic, and it's titled Designing Memory, the Architecture of Commemoration in Europe from 1914 to the present, and it's based on her really fascinating new book, so please do join us for that. In the meantime, thank you so much, Bea, again, wishing you all a lovely rest of the evening and week. Nice to see you all. See you soon.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Bye. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.